Sergeant Jack Harlow trudged through the scorching desert of the planet Centros, his boots sinking slightly into the shifting sands. The sky above was a cloudless blue, and the heat was unbearable. Sweat ran down his face, and the air shimmered with the intensity of the sun. He had been stranded here for days after a crash landing, and supplies were running low. His only hope was to find some kind of shelter, or better yet, another survivor. Jack wiped his brow and scanned the horizon. Nothing but endless sand and rocky formations stretched before him. He had already searched for hours, but with no luck. The distress beacon from his ship was still pinging weakly in the distance, but Jack knew it would be a while before rescue could reach him. He had to survive on his own for now. As Jack was about to turn back, something caught his eye. A flash of movement in the distance. A figure, stumbling weakly through the desert, appeared to be dragging something behind her. It was a woman, and she was clearly in trouble. Her gait was unsteady, and she looked as though she had been walking for days. Jack's instincts kicked in. Despite the overwhelming heat, he jogged toward her, his mind racing. "Hey, are you all right?" Jack called out as he approached. His voice was hoarse from the dry air. The woman stopped and looked at him, her eyes bright but filled with pain. Her skin had a strange, almost metallic sheen to it, and her features were unlike any human Jack had ever seen. Her hair, or what appeared to be hair, was long and silver, flowing like strands of liquid mercury in the wind. Despite her delicate appearance, Jack could see the toughness in her eyes. She was no ordinary person. I need help," she whispered, her voice weak. She collapsed to her knees, and Jack rushed to her side. He knelt beside her, feeling the heat radiating off her. "Hey, easy there. What happened to you? You look like you've been out here a long time." The woman's hand reached out, and Jack instinctively took it, helping her sit up. "My ship crashed. I'm stranded," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how much longer I can survive here." Jack studied her closely. She seemed exhausted, dehydrated, and close to collapse. There were bruises and cuts all over her body, but what struck him the most was the strange, almost unnatural glow in her eyes. It was faint, but there was something about it that made Jack uneasy. "Where did your ship crash?" Jack asked, scanning the horizon. "I'm looking for my own ship, and if we can find yours, maybe we can get out of here together." The woman looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "It crashed not far from here," she said, "but I don't know if I can make it that far. I'm not sure how much more I can walk." Jack felt a surge of sympathy. He had been through tough situations before, but he couldn't leave her out here alone. "Don't worry," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'll help you get there. Just hang on." She nodded, but Jack could see that she was struggling to stay awake. Her body trembled as she sat up, and Jack quickly supported her as they stood together. "Here, let me carry you," Jack said, not waiting for a response. He gently lifted her in his arms, feeling the weight of her surprisingly light frame. Despite the heat, he wasn't going to leave her behind. There was something about her that made him feel responsible, even though he knew nothing about her. As Jack began walking, he noticed the faint traces of a shipwreck in the distance. The silhouette of a large, twisted metal structure rose from the sand like a broken skeleton. It was in bad shape, but it was definitely a ship, likely the woman's. The wreckage was at least a few miles away, but Jack was determined to reach it. "You're going to make it," Jack reassured her, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "We're almost there." But as they approached the wreckage, something strange happened. The woman suddenly tensed in his arms, her grip tightening on his shirt. Her eyes snapped open wide, and the faint glow in them intensified. She was no longer the fragile, injured woman Jack had been helping. There was something different in her expression, something more alert. "Wait," she whispered urgently. "We are not alone." Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced around but saw nothing. The desert was eerily silent, the wind blowing sand across the barren landscape, but there was an unsettling feeling in the air. Something, or someone, was out there, watching them. The woman looked at him, her voice now steady, though still faint. "I can handle this," she said, her tone filled with quiet strength. "But you need to stay out of the way." Jack didn't know what she meant, but one thing was clear. The woman he had found in the desert was far more than just a stranded survivor. There was something about her that was both dangerous and mesmerizing. And now, he was going to find out just who, or what, she really was. Jack stared out over the wreckage of the ship, his muscles tense, every sense on high alert. The woman, Karaketh, she had finally whispered her name, had stopped talking after that cryptic warning. She had let go of his shirt, her strange glow dimming as she regained some strength. She had insisted on walking on her own, though Jack still stayed close, ready to support her if needed. But now, as they moved closer to the wreck, there was an uneasy silence between them. The wreckage of her ship lay half buried in sand, its twisted metal half hidden by the desert winds. It was clear the ship had been destroyed in some kind of violent crash. The front half of the craft was burned out completely, the cockpit shattered, and the hull was crushed beyond recognition. It looked like something out of a nightmare. Jack's gut twisted. What kind of ship could survive that kind of impact? Karaketh seemed to pay little attention to the wreck, walking straight toward a small part of the wreckage that Jack could barely make out, an emergency escape pod, still intact. Her face was unreadable, but Jack could see a flicker of something dark in her eyes. Worry, regret, it was hard to tell. She paused in front of the pod and placed her hand on the smooth metal surface. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment, like she was gathering herself. "Is this your escape pod?" Jack asked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Karaketh nodded slowly, but her eyes didn't leave the pod. Yes, this was the only part of the ship that survived. Jack nodded, trying to understand. He had been in enough crashes to know how brutal they could be, but the escape pod still looked like it could function. "Can you still use it?" he asked. Karaketh turned to him with a sharp look. Her eyes were now fully glowing, and Jack could feel an unspoken power radiating from her. "I don't think I'll be leaving in that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are more important things at stake." Jack wanted to ask more, but before he could, he heard a sound, faint but unmistakable. A distant hum, like engines. His heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, scanning the horizon. Karaketh's eyes flicked to the sky, her expression darkening. "They're here," she muttered, almost too softly for Jack to hear. "Who's here?" Jack asked, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. He had no idea what kind of enemies he was up against, but he knew one thing. He wasn't about to let anyone take Karaketh or himself without a fight. Karaketh didn't answer at first. She walked to the side of the wreckage, her steps light and graceful despite the weariness in her movements. Her hand reached out, pressing against a hidden control panel on the side of the escape pod. Jack watched her, confused, as she activated a small, concealed antenna that extended out of the pod. "They'll be looking for the artifact," Karaketh said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "The one I came to find." Jack raised an eyebrow. Artifact. He had no idea what she was talking about. The only thing he knew for sure was that this desert was about to get a lot more dangerous. Before Karaketh could say more, a loud roar of engines interrupted them. Jack's eyes widened as he spotted the source of the sound. 3 heavily armed ships descended from the sky, their dark shapes cutting through the atmosphere with deadly precision. They landed in a tight formation, kicking up a cloud of dust as they touched down just a few hundred yards away. Karaketh turned to Jack, her face hardening. "I told you," she said, her voice now sharp and filled with determination. "We have to move. Now." Jack's heart raced. The ships were enemy craft, no doubt. He didn't need to know who they were to understand that they meant trouble. The ships were armed to the teeth, with weapons visible along their sides. Jack had fought against mercenaries, pirates, and every type of enemy imaginable. But this felt different. There was something dangerous and powerful about Karaketh that made him feel both reassured and, oddly enough, fearful. Without a word, Jack followed Karaketh as she moved quickly toward the wrecked ship, her eyes never leaving the incoming ships. She was quick, moving with the kind of focus Jack had only seen in the most experienced soldiers. She was no longer the weak, injured woman he had helped earlier. This was someone entirely different. She seemed to radiate an air of control, like she was already preparing for the fight ahead. Jack could feel the adrenaline rising. He had been in combat before, but this was unlike anything he had experienced. His survival instincts kicked in as he scanned the area, looking for a way to defend themselves. He didn't have much to work with, just a few basic weapons and his wits. But Karaketh, she was something else. He didn't know if she was human or something entirely different, but there was no doubt in his mind now that she could handle herself. "We can't stay here," Jack said, looking over his shoulder as the enemy ships began to unload their troops. Armed mercenaries in black armor started pouring out, their weapons raised, ready for a fight. Karaketh didn't even flinch. "We don't need to run," she said quietly. "We're going to fight." Jack looked at her, unsure what she meant, but one thing was clear: the game had changed. They weren't just running from danger anymore. They were about to face it head-on. The mercenaries were closing in fast, their heavy boots thudding on the sand, their dark helmets glinting in the sunlight. Jack could feel the tension in the air as Karaketh stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the approaching group. Her expression was calm, almost unnervingly so. Jack, on the other hand, felt his heart pounding in his chest, his fingers tightening around his weapon. The mercenaries had clearly noticed them. There was no hiding now. Jack took a quick glance at Karaketh. Her eyes were glowing faintly again, the soft light giving her an almost otherworldly appearance. He could see her muscles tense, preparing for what was about to come. "You need to stay behind me," she said, her voice low but firm. "Do not try to fight them. This is my battle." Jack hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had fought in many battles, had faced dangerous enemies before, but he wasn't sure he could just sit back and watch. "I don't know if I can do that," he said, his voice filled with doubt. Karaketh turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "You can," she said simply. "And you will." Before Jack could argue, she moved. Her speed was unreal. One moment, she was standing beside him, and the next, she was charging toward the mercenaries, her body a blur of motion. Jack's mouth went dry as he watched her move. Her movements were fluid, precise, and almost impossible to follow. She wasn't just running. She was a force of nature. The mercenaries were armed with rifles and pistols, but Karaketh didn't seem to care. As the first soldier fired at her, she ducked, rolling to the side with an agility Jack had never seen. In one fluid motion, she was on her feet again, her hand reaching out to grab the soldier's arm and twist it behind his back. The soldier screamed, dropping his weapon, and Karaketh threw him to the ground with a single, swift motion. The rest of the mercenaries hesitated, clearly unsure of how to react. Karaketh didn't give them time to think. She was already moving toward the next soldier, her speed and strength overwhelming. She slammed her fist into his chest, sending him stumbling back in shock. Another soldier tried to get a shot off, but Karaketh was already on him, disarming him and knocking him out cold with a quick strike to the neck. Jack stood frozen, his eyes wide in disbelief. He had never seen anything like this. Karaketh was fighting with a skill and precision that seemed impossible for a human. She moved like she was born for battle, and each strike was calculated, perfect. As Karaketh took down two more mercenaries with ease, Jack snapped out of his daze. He knew he had to help, even if it was just a distraction. He quickly aimed his rifle at the nearest mercenary, firing a shot that hit the soldier in the shoulder. The man grunted and staggered back, giving Karaketh the opening she needed to knock him out. "Nice shot," Karaketh called over her shoulder, not breaking her focus as she moved toward another opponent. But don't get too comfortable. This fight is far from over. Jack felt a surge of pride at her words. Maybe he wasn't totally useless in this fight after all. But as the battle continued, he realized that the mercenaries weren't backing down. They were regrouping, trying to surround them. It was clear they weren't just after Karaketh. They were after something more. Karaketh moved to Jack's side, her breathing steady despite the chaos around them. "They're not just here for us," she said, her voice low. "They're after the artifact, and they won't stop until they have it." Jack nodded, understanding now that the stakes were much higher than he'd originally thought. He had no idea what this artifact was, but it was clear that the enemy would do anything to get it. As the mercenaries continued to close in, Jack could feel the ground shifting beneath them. There were too many of them. He knew they couldn't keep fighting forever. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Karaketh's eyes flickered to the sky, where the remaining mercenary ships were circling, ready to drop more troops if needed. She turned back to Jack. "We don't fight them all," she said. "We make sure they don't get the artifact. That's our only priority now." Jack didn't have time to question her plan. As a group of mercenaries made their move, Karaketh acted first. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and pulled out a small glowing device. With a quick flick of her wrist, she threw it to the ground. The device emitted a loud, high-pitched sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around them. The mercenaries stopped in their tracks, their faces twisting in confusion and pain. The sound was like nothing Jack had ever heard. It was piercing, almost unbearable. The mercenaries dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, struggling to stay on their feet. "This is your chance," Karaketh said, her voice calm as ever. "Get to the artifact. I'll hold them off." Jack didn't hesitate. He ran toward the wrecked ship, pushing past the mercenaries who were still disoriented by the noise. He didn't know where the artifact was hidden, but he had to find it before the mercenaries could recover. As he reached the wreck, he spotted a small compartment in the side of the ship, half buried in sand. He quickly pried it open, praying that he would find what they were looking for. Inside, a small glowing box sat nestled in the sand, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. Jack knew, without a doubt, that this was it, the artifact. Jack's fingers wrapped around the glowing box, the strange energy inside it humming gently against his skin. He could feel its power, intense, like nothing he had ever experienced before. For a moment, he just stared at it, unsure of what to do next. His heart was racing, his mind buzzing with questions. What was this thing? And why were the mercenaries willing to risk everything to get it? But there was no time to think. The sound of footsteps and the crackle of weapons being ready pulled him back to reality. The mercenaries were recovering from Karaketh's sonic attack, and they were not going to give up easily. Jack quickly stuffed the box into his jacket and turned back toward the wreckage. He spotted Karaketh fighting two more mercenaries, moving with incredible speed and precision. She was a blur of motion, her movements graceful and deadly, but Jack could see she was starting to tire. The mercenaries had regrouped, and now they were coming at her from all sides. Without thinking, Jack ran toward her, drawing his weapon. He fired a few shots at the nearest soldier, causing him to stumble back. Karaketh glanced at him and nodded in thanks, her glowing eyes flashing. She was already back in motion, throwing a kick that sent one mercenary flying across the sand. "You're not bad," she said between breaths, her voice steady despite the chaos. "But you need to stay focused. The artifact is more important than us." Jack didn't argue. He knew she was right. As much as he wanted to help her fight, his job was to protect the artifact. He could see it now, glimmering in the back of his mind, as if the power within it was calling to him. It wasn't just a physical object. It was something much more. But what? His thoughts were interrupted when a loud roar filled the air. A massive transport ship appeared overhead, blocking out the sun as it descended rapidly toward the battlefield. The ship's black silhouette loomed larger as it neared the ground. And Jack knew this was no ordinary ship. It was a heavy-duty assault vessel, designed for one thing: war. Karaketh stopped fighting for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she looked up at the ship. Her expression was unreadable, but Jack could see the determination in her gaze. "It's him," she said softly. "Him," Jack repeated, confusion clouding his thoughts. He wasn't sure who she was talking about, but one thing was clear: whoever this person was, they were in charge. The ship landed with a loud thud, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The doors opened, and out stepped a tall figure in black armor, his face hidden behind a dark helmet. The air seemed to grow colder as he stepped onto the sand, the mercenaries around him falling into formation. This was no regular soldier. This was a leader. Karaketh tensed, her body coiled like a spring. "Get ready," she said quietly to Jack. "He's the one I've been running from." Jack's eyes widened. "You're telling me he's after the artifact too?" She nodded, her expression hardening. "And he won't stop until he has it." The man in black armor raised his hand, and his mercenaries immediately fell into position, weapons aimed at Karaketh and Jack. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear: surrender or die. Karaketh moved to stand in front of Jack, her stance protective. "You need to leave," she said, her voice cold. "I can hold him off. Just take the artifact and get out of here." Jack opened his mouth to protest, but Karaketh cut him off. "Now, soldier," she snapped. He hesitated, then nodded, the weight of the artifact in his jacket feeling heavier than ever. He wasn't sure where to go or what to do, but he knew he couldn't just leave Karaketh to face this alone. She had saved him more than once already. He wasn't going to abandon her now. But before he could take a step, the man in black armor spoke, his voice low and commanding. "You have no idea what you're holding, do you?" His words were directed at Karaketh, but Jack could feel the weight of them too. She didn't flinch. "I know exactly what I'm holding," she said, her voice steady. "And you'll never get it." The man in black armor raised a hand, signaling his troops to advance. "Then you leave me no choice," he said. "We will take it by force." Suddenly, the air around them seemed to crackle with energy. Karaketh's eyes glowed brighter, her body shifting slightly, like she was preparing for something far beyond what Jack could comprehend. She stepped forward, her posture strong, ready for the fight to come. Jack didn't know how he knew it, but he felt the same energy that was pulsing from Karaketh, also coming from the artifact. It was almost as if the two were connected, two forces of power pulling in opposite directions. He didn't understand it, but he felt that if the artifact fell into the wrong hands, something terrible would happen. The tension between the two sides grew thick, the sand beneath them stirring as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Jack made his decision. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the artifact, holding it up between him and the approaching enemy. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice was shaky. The power in his hands felt alive, almost like it had a mind of its own. The man in black armor stopped in his tracks, his helmet tilting slightly. "You don't understand," he said. "You can't control it. It was never meant for your kind." Jack's grip on the artifact tightened. "I don't care what it was meant for," he said through gritted teeth. "I'm not letting you have it." Karaketh's voice cut through the air like a knife. "Do not listen to him," she warned. "He'll use it to destroy everything." Jack glanced at her, understanding now what he was up against. The artifact was dangerous, but it was also their only chance. The standoff between the two sides continued, the desert quiet except for the distant hum of the assault ship's engines. The fate of the artifact, and their lives, hung in the balance. The desert air was thick with tension as Jack held the artifact out in front of him, his hands trembling with the weight of its power. The man in black armor, who had yet to reveal his identity, stood motionless, his dark helmet fixed on Jack with unnerving focus. The mercenaries behind him remained still as well, their weapons raised but waiting for their leader's command. Karaketh, standing beside Jack, radiated determination, her glowing eyes never leaving the figure in front of them. "You think you can control it?" The man's voice echoed, cold and unyielding. "That artifact is not meant for your kind. It is a weapon, a force of unimaginable destruction. You do not understand what you are holding." Jack didn't flinch, though he could feel the weight of the words in his chest. The artifact in his hand seemed to hum, as if responding to the threat. He wasn't sure what it was, but the energy that radiated from it was undeniable. It was powerful, more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. But Jack wasn't about to back down. Not now. "You're wrong," Jack said, his voice stronger than he felt. "I don't know what it is, but I'm not going to let you have it." The man in black armor took a step forward, his boots crunching softly on the sand. "You don't know what you're dealing with. I can help you understand. You can't wield that power. It was never meant for people like you." Karaketh stepped forward, her voice cutting through the conversation. "You think you can control it, don't you?" she said, her words filled with contempt. "You've been trying to control everything for too long, but you've forgotten one thing." The man's head tilted slightly, as if intrigued. "And what is that?" "That it's not just a weapon," Karaketh said, her eyes flashing. "It's alive." Jack's heart skipped a beat. Alive? He turned to look at Karaketh, confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean, alive?" he asked, still holding the artifact tightly in his hands. Karaketh's gaze never wavered from the armored man. "The artifact is more than just a tool of destruction. It's a sentient force, a being that has existed for eons. It chooses its wielder, and it will not let anyone use it who isn't worthy." The man in black armor sneered. "You think it chooses? Ridiculous. It was created by my ancestors to be controlled, and I will have it." Jack felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward the artifact. It was as if it was speaking to him, calling out to him. He could feel the energy inside it, the power that seemed to surge with every heartbeat. It wasn't just a weapon. It was something much more, something ancient. "No," Jack said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "I don't care who created it. I'm not letting you take it." The man's eyes narrowed. "Then you leave me no choice." He raised his hand, signaling his mercenaries to advance. The soldiers moved swiftly, their weapons aimed at Jack and Karaketh. They were closing in fast, but Jack wasn't about to let them take him without a fight. He could feel the artifact pulsing in his hands, as if it was giving him strength. He had no idea how, but he knew he wasn't alone in this. Karaketh turned to Jack. "Stay close to me. Do not let them get the artifact." Jack nodded, determination hardening in his chest. He wasn't a soldier, but he could fight when it mattered. He raised his weapon and fired at the nearest mercenary, knocking him back with a clean shot. But there were too many of them, and the man in black armor was still standing there, watching as if everything was just a game to him. "We need to get out of here," Jack said urgently. He knew they couldn't hold their ground much longer. The mercenaries were closing in, and the leader wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. Karaketh's gaze flickered to the sky, where the assault ship still hovered, ready to drop more soldiers if needed. She didn't seem worried, though. Her focus was on the man in black armor. "We won't be able to outrun them," she said quietly. "But we don't need to." Jack's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" "This artifact, it's not just a weapon. It can open doors. It can take us anywhere, anywhere in the universe. We just have to use it." The idea was ridiculous, but Jack didn't have time to question it. He could feel the power of the artifact growing stronger in his hands, and he knew they were running out of time. The mercenaries were almost upon them now. The man in black armor was getting closer, his presence oppressive. "Give it to me," he demanded. "You cannot run from your fate." But Jack didn't hesitate. With Karaketh's voice in his ear, he focused all his will on the artifact. His heart pounded as he visualized the world beyond the desert. Anywhere but here. The artifact began to glow brighter, its energy filling the air, with a strange, almost electric charge. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick with anticipation. The man in black armor reached out to seize the artifact, but before he could make a move, there was a sudden flash of light, brilliant and blinding. The desert around them disappeared in an instant, and Jack felt himself being pulled away, as though the very fabric of reality was bending to the artifact's will. For a brief moment, everything was chaos, light, sound, and force swirling around them. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The world around them was gone, and they were somewhere new, somewhere far from the desert. Jack stood still, breathing heavily, his heart still racing. He looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. They were no longer in the desert. In fact, they weren't anywhere he recognized. The ground beneath his feet was soft, almost like grass, and the air was fresh, cool, and unfamiliar. Karaketh stood beside him, looking around with an expression of relief. "We're safe," she said quietly, her voice filled with awe. For now. Jack glanced at her, still processing the strange, powerful event that had just unfolded. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Karaketh's gaze lingered on the landscape, somewhere far from them. She said, her tone serious, "Somewhere where they can't find us. But we can't stay here long." Jack nodded, understanding. They had just escaped, but the fight was far from over. The world around Jack was unlike anything he had ever seen. The landscape was vast and green, with towering trees and winding rivers that shimmered in the light. It was peaceful, serene, almost too perfect to be real. He took a deep breath, the air fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the dry, dusty desert they had just escaped. "Where are we?" Jack asked again, his voice still filled with awe. The sudden shift from the harsh desert to this beautiful alien world was almost too much to process. Karaketh stood beside him, her eyes scanning the area with cautious precision. Her posture was alert, but she seemed more at ease here than she had in the desert. "I don't know the exact location," she said, her voice calm, "but this is a place that is hidden from the rest of the universe. Few know about it, and fewer still can find it." Jack frowned. "But how? How did we end up here?" "That artifact. It just transported us." She nodded. "The artifact is more than just a weapon. It's a key, a gateway to other worlds. It chooses who can use it, and in this case, it chose to bring us here." Jack looked at the artifact still clutched tightly in his hands. The soft glow had faded, but he could still feel the hum of its power deep within it. It was like nothing he had ever felt before. It wasn't just an object. It was a force that had just taken them across space in an instant. And now they were somewhere else, somewhere safe. But for how long? "We need to stay low," Karaketh said, breaking his thoughts. She glanced around, her eyes narrowing as if she sensed something just beyond their reach. "This place may be hidden, but it isn't entirely safe. There are others who guard it, and they will not take kindly to visitors." Jack nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. He wasn't sure what Karaketh meant by others, but he knew that if they had any chance of surviving, they needed to be careful. Karaketh turned, leading Jack into the dense forest ahead. The trees around them were tall, their leaves shimmering with an iridescent glow. It was like they had stepped into another world, one untouched by time or war. The peaceful atmosphere, however, did little to ease the tension building inside Jack. He knew that they were far from safe. "Who are these people guarding this place?" Jack asked as they walked. He kept his eyes peeled for any signs of movement, unsure of what they might encounter in this strange new world. "They are the Keepers," Karaketh explained, her voice steady. "Ancient protectors of the artifact and the gateway worlds. They were chosen long ago to guard the power of the artifact, ensuring it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." Jack's grip tightened around the artifact. "The wrong hands," he repeated, his mind racing. He had to keep it safe. no matter what. They walked in silence for a while, the soft sounds of the forest filling the air. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over him, though he knew it was only temporary. Karaketh's words were still fresh in his mind. The keepers were watching, and they would come for the artifact. He just hoped they had enough time to figure out what to do next. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached the edge of a clearing. In the center stood an enormous stone structure, partially overgrown with vines and moss. It was ancient, worn by time, yet its design was intricate and majestic. Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he stared at it. This was no ordinary building. It was a temple, a place of great significance. "This is the place," Karaketh said, her voice low and reverent. "The heart of the artifact's power. The keepers will come here when they sense its presence. We need to be ready." Jack looked at her, confused. "Ready for what?" "For the trial," she said, her eyes hardening. "The keepers will test us. They will see if we are worthy of the artifact's power. If we pass, they may let us leave in peace. If we fail—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jack didn't need her to. The warning was clear. Jack took a deep breath. He wasn't sure what kind of trial they were about to face, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let them take the artifact, not without a fight. They approached the temple cautiously, stepping lightly on the soft grass. The air grew heavier, and Jack could feel a strange energy pulsing in the ground beneath his feet. It was as if the very land was alive, aware of their presence. As they neared the entrance, the doors of the temple slowly creaked open, revealing a dark interior filled with intricate carvings and glowing symbols. "This is it," Karaketh said softly, stepping forward. "We must go inside. The keepers will be watching us, but they won't show themselves until we are inside." Jack hesitated for a moment before following her inside. The darkness swallowed them as they stepped through the door, but the symbols on the walls glowed faintly, providing enough light to guide them. The air was thick with the scent of ancient stone and incense, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes. In the center of the temple stood an altar, and on it lay a stone pedestal. The artifact pulsed with energy as Jack approached, its light flickering in the dim room. He placed the artifact on the pedestal, feeling the warmth of its power radiating through his fingertips. A deep, resonating voice filled the room, though Jack couldn't tell where it was coming from. "You have brought the artifact here, but you are not its true bearers. To wield its power, you must prove your worth." Jack's heart raced. The trial had begun. The voice continued, "Only those who are worthy will leave with the artifact. The rest will remain here, trapped for eternity." Karaketh stepped forward, her posture straight and determined. "We are ready," she said, her voice firm. "We will prove our worth." Jack felt a surge of confidence at her words. He didn't know what kind of trial awaited them, but if Karaketh believed they could pass, then he would believe it too. They had come this far together, and he wasn't about to give up now. The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. The voice had faded into the shadows, but its words lingered in Jack's mind, echoing in his thoughts. "Only those who are worthy will leave with the artifact." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of the artifact, now resting on the pedestal in front of him, seemed to grow heavier. The soft glow it emitted was the only light in the temple, but it wasn't enough to dispel the darkness that pressed in around them. Karaketh stood beside him, her eyes narrowing, her posture still confident. "We need to stay focused," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack nodded, though inside, his heart raced. The trial had begun. There was no turning back now. He could feel the power of the artifact pulsing, as if it was waiting for something, waiting for them to prove they were worthy. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air grew thick, vibrating with an unseen force. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, casting strange, shifting patterns across the stone floor. Jack took a step back, instinctively reaching for his weapon, but Karaketh's hand on his arm stopped him. "Do not be afraid," she said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. "This is part of the trial. The keepers are testing us." Jack didn't know how to respond. He had no idea what kind of trial they were about to face. But one thing was clear: the keepers were powerful, and they wouldn't give up the artifact easily. A low rumbling sound filled the air, and then, from the shadows, figures began to emerge. At first, they were just silhouettes, but as they stepped into the light, Jack saw them clearly. The keepers were tall, cloaked in robes that seemed to shimmer with the same light as the symbols on the walls. Their faces were hidden, but Jack could feel their presence, strong, ancient, and full of purpose. One of the keepers stepped forward, his voice deep and commanding. "You seek to wield the power of the artifact. But to do so, you must first prove your hearts are pure and your intentions true." Jack swallowed hard. His mind raced. Prove our hearts are pure. What did that even mean? The keeper continued. "You will face 3 trials. Each trial will test your strength, your wisdom, and your courage. Fail any one, and the artifact will remain beyond your reach." Jack turned to Karaketh, but she was already looking at him, her expression unreadable. She nodded, as if silently telling him that they could do this, that they had to do this. The first keeper raised his hand, and suddenly, the room shifted. The ground beneath their feet crumbled away, and Jack found himself standing on a narrow bridge, suspended high above a vast chasm. The wind howled around him, and below, the darkness seemed endless. "This is the first trial," the keeper's voice echoed from somewhere in the shadows. "Face the fear of the unknown." The chasm seemed to stretch endlessly, the wind growing fiercer with every passing second. Jack's heart thudded in his chest as he looked down, trying to keep his balance on the precarious bridge. He wasn't afraid of heights, but something about the vast emptiness below made his stomach churn. He turned to Karaketh, who was standing firm beside him, though her eyes showed a hint of uncertainty. "We have to move forward," she said. "This is only the beginning. Do not let it control you." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. He could do this. He had to. The artifact was the key to everything, and they couldn't afford to fail. They took a step forward, the bridge creaking beneath their feet, the wind pushing against them. The further they went, the harder it became to focus. The darkness below seemed to call to him, the chasm threatening to swallow them whole. But Jack kept his eyes on the path ahead. He couldn't let fear take over. He couldn't fail. Finally, they reached the end of the bridge. The ground beneath them solidified, and the chasm disappeared, leaving them in the center of the temple once again. The keeper's voice echoed, approving. "You have passed the first trial. Now face the second." The room shifted again. The walls around them seemed to melt away, and they found themselves standing in a large open field under a bright sky. A soft breeze blew through the grass, and the sunlight warmed their skin. It was beautiful, peaceful. But Jack's heart beat faster. There was something wrong. Something was off. "The second trial," the keeper's voice came again, "is wisdom. You must solve the riddle of the earth." Suddenly, the ground in front of them began to shift, forming a large stone tablet with ancient inscriptions. The symbols were unfamiliar, but Jack could feel that they were important. This was the key to passing the second trial. Karaketh stepped forward, studying the tablet with a focused expression. Jack watched her, hoping she would have the answer. He trusted her. She had always been the one with the answers. "This is it," Karaketh said softly, reading the symbols aloud. "The key is not in the knowledge of the mind, but in the understanding of the heart." Jack looked at her, confused. "What does that mean?" She smiled, her eyes sparkling with understanding. "It means that the answer is not in the puzzle itself. It is in how we approach it. We must trust our instincts." Without hesitation, Karaketh placed her hand on the tablet, and a surge of energy pulsed through the room. The stone tablet glowed brightly, and the air hummed with a strange energy. Jack felt it too. The answer had been inside them all along. They had passed the second trial. The keeper's voice sounded again. You have completed the second trial. Now, only the third remains. The room began to change once more, but this time, Jack wasn't afraid. He knew they had come this far. They could finish it. Together.